Tonight, we're sinking into one of the longest bedtime stories in human history, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. So, dim your lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back about 2.5 millennia, because nothing says sleepy like senators in togas arguing about grain supply. Rome. The cliché goes that it wasn't built in a day, which is true. It took centuries, and about 1 million bad decisions, family feuds, and political backstabbings. And at the end of it all, the empire collapsed anyway. So, uplifting bedtime material? But before we even get to emperors and armies, we have to start with a story that is, frankly, closer to a fairy tale. You know the one. 2 abandoned twins, Romulus and Remus, being nursed by a she-wolf, because apparently, the Romans thought wolf milk was the ultimate protein shake. Later writers admitted that maybe wolf was a mistranslation of wolfish woman, basically a prostitute, which honestly makes more sense and also feels extremely Roman. Anyway, Romulus and Remus grow up, get into a brotherly squabble, and Romulus kills Remus. Because apparently, family values in ancient Rome meant stabbing your sibling if he walked on the wrong side of your imaginary fence. With his brother conveniently out of the way, Romulus founded the city of Rome in 753 BCE, or at least, that's the date Roman historians like to write down. Whether or not it's true is irrelevant. Romans loved a good origin myth, especially one that made them sound tough and a little unhinged. So, the city grows. Slowly at first. Picture a swampy collection of huts on 7 hills. Not very glamorous. Early Romans were basically farmers who occasionally kidnapped their neighbors' women to keep the population going. Yes, that's the rape of the Sabine women story. Not exactly a heartwarming cultural tradition, but hey, it gave Rome some in-laws. Over the next couple of centuries, Rome became a monarchy. They had 7 kings, or so tradition says. Some were semi-mythical, like Numa Pompilius, who supposedly invented half the Roman religion by making deals with gods in the forest. One king, Tarquin the Proud, lived up to his name by being a complete tyrant. He was so arrogant and unpleasant that the Romans collectively decided they were done with kings forever. Which sounds decisive, except of course, humans never actually learn. So, around 509 BCE, Rome reinvented itself as a republic, which didn't mean democracy. It meant the rich men in town got to argue in the Senate while everyone else hoped not to starve. But it worked well enough. For centuries, Rome expanded. At first, just fighting local Italian neighbors, then further afield. Eventually, Rome went from being that scrappy city by the Tiber to that terrifying machine that keeps eating Mediterranean coastlines. Let's float over to one of the juiciest early turning points. The Punic Wars. Rome versus Carthage. 3 rounds of pure mutual destruction, starting in 264 BCE. Carthage was rich, powerful, and had the best navy in the Mediterranean. Rome had stubborn farmers who refused to give up. Enter Hannibal. Yes, the guy with elephants. He marched them over the Alps, which sounds heroic until you realize half the elephants froze to death. Still, Hannibal gave Rome nightmares for years, crushing Roman armies in battles like Cannae, where tens of thousands of Romans were killed in one day. Rome responded the only way Rome knew how, by throwing more soldiers into the meat grinder. Eventually, they wore Hannibal down, invaded Carthage, and burned it to the ground. Rome, 1. Carthage, 0. Now, Rome basically owned the Western Mediterranean, and once Rome owned something, it rarely gave it back. Sicily, Spain, North Africa, all added to the empire in the making. The wealth flowed in, along with slaves, which meant rich Romans got richer, while poor Romans wondered why they even bothered. The Republic, as you might guess, didn't handle wealth inequality gracefully. Cue centuries of political chaos. You've got tribunes like the Gracchi brothers trying to reform land ownership, only to be beaten to death by senators with furniture. You've got generals like Marius and Sulla who turned their armies on Rome itself. Yes, that was technically illegal, but Roman generals tended to do whatever they wanted if they had enough legions behind them. And then, of course, comes Julius Caesar. We can't not talk about him. The man was ambitious, stylish, and very aware of his hairline. He spent years conquering Gaul, which is basically modern-day France, and wrote about it in such a flattering way that even today we mostly know his version of events. He then crossed the Rubicon River with his army in 49 BCE, which was his way of saying, "Surprise, I'm overthrowing the government." Civil war followed. Caesar won, became dictator for life, and then, naturally, got stabbed 23 times by senators pretending they were saving the Republic. Spoiler, they didn't save it. They just created another civil war. Because if there's one constant in Roman politics, it's that killing someone famous usually makes things worse. After a lot of bloodshed, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later called Augustus, came out on top. And that, friends, is where the Republic died and the Empire was born. Augustus was clever. He pretended he was just first citizen, while actually hoarding power like a dragon. The Senate still existed, but mostly as decoration. Augustus controlled the armies, the provinces, and the money. In return, he gave Rome peace, or at least fewer civil wars than before. This period, known as the Pax Romana, was Rome's golden age. Roads, aqueducts, and colosseums, trade across the empire, a functioning postal system, because apparently even ancient empires needed junk mail. The empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia. It was the closest the ancient world came to globalization. Of course, even in this golden age, emperors were a mixed bag. Some were competent, like Augustus or Trajan. Others were, let's say, eccentric. Caligula, for example, tried to appoint his horse as a consul. Nero preferred performing in plays to governing, and supposedly fiddled while Rome burned. Though, to be fair, fiddles didn't exist yet. He probably just panicked badly. The empire kept expanding, but cracks were forming. Emperors didn't usually die peacefully in bed. They were assassinated, overthrown, or killed in battle. Succession was messy. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's supposed bodyguards, turned into kingmakers, auctioning off the throne to whoever paid them the most. Not exactly stable governance. By the 3rd century CE, things got especially chaotic. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, which is polite shorthand for everything fell apart at once. Rome had dozens of emperors in quick succession, most of whom didn't last long enough to get a proper portrait painted. The empire was invaded from all sides. Plagues spread, the economy collapsed. It was, frankly, a disaster. But Rome wasn't done yet. A few strong emperors, like Diocletian and Constantine, managed to patch things up. Diocletian even split the empire into east and west to make it more manageable, which sounds sensible until you realize it also set the stage for centuries of rivalry. Constantine, meanwhile, legalized Christianity and moved the capital to a shiny new city, Constantinople, which was basically saying, "Sorry, Rome, you're kind of outdated now." And here's the thing. The Western Roman Empire never really recovered. By the 5th century, it was a shadow of itself. Germanic tribes crossed the borders. Rome itself was sacked more than once. And in 476 CE, the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. Yes, the last Roman emperor had the same name as the mythical founder of Rome, Romulus, which is either poetic or just cruel irony. The Eastern Empire, though what we call the Byzantine Empire, kept going for another 1,000 years, but that's another story. So, that's the outline. But don't worry, we're not done. We're going to drift slowly through all the messy details. The emperors, the scandals, the turning points where Rome almost collapsed but held on anyway. Like a particularly stubborn relative who refuses to leave the party even after the lights are turned off. Let's float over to our first deep dive.